Joining us right now by phone is Austin Ruse. Good morning to you, Austin.
Hey, how are you?
Praise be to God, I am alive, and that counts. How are you?
Well, not too bad. Glad to be with you guys.
Hey, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you, by the way.
Same to you.
So you have an article that I found very interesting over at Crisis Magazine, the weaponization of loneliness. A topic we talk often about on the program is the transgendered ideology that seems to be twisting the world into complete knots. And I would say the diabolic response to pro-life protests, to the protests at drag queen story hours, and so much more. But you had an interesting take on this. Tell me about it.
Well, it's more along the lines of gaslighting. One of the great human drives is for company, for family, for friends, and one of the great fears is isolation. This is why going to prison and being isolated in prison is such a frightening prospect. Guys who are in isolation cells for 23 hours a day, terrifying prospect. Well, in our everyday lives, that we do have that prospect of being isolated and shunned from friends for the particular positions that we may hold that align with the teachings of the church or whatever. And so the left, the sexual left, understands this, and so they want to impose this idea on people that if you get too far off the political correct too far off the political correct range, you may be isolated. You may be isolated from friends and family. You may be isolated from people in everyday life, and this is especially among the young. Well, I guess everybody is a terrifying prospect. So the weaponization of loneliness is making people understand that if they take a wrong position, they could be isolated in their social milieu, lose friends, lose family, so on and so forth. And this is especially acute these days in the issues of sexual morality, in all the whole panoply of LGBT issues most especially, but not limited to that.
Yeah. Mr. Ruse, I'm thinking as you're talking about this, it really is diabolic. The enemy really seeks to scatter as opposed to our Lord who gathers, and really in scattering us, he's trying to corral us there.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. Who in the column, I'm really writing about the work of a remarkable woman named Stella Morabito. Stella Morabito was a longtime analyst at CIA, expert in Soviet propaganda. And so she looked back at what the Soviets did in this particular area, what the Nazis did in this particular area. In the Soviet era and the Nazi era, you had moms and dads afraid to say anything in front of their children because of the fear that their children might tell on them. And there was a great hero of the Soviet Union, a boy who told on his father, and his father was sent to the Gulag because his father had the wrong views with regard to the Soviet Union. We live in an era, many years ago I did a series of stories about employees at J.P. Morgan Chase, the fourth largest financial institution in the world at that time, and maybe it's even bigger now, I don't know. And they had, all employees at J.P. Morgan Chase, massive company, had received an employee survey asking, a lot of inane questions, but also this question: are you LGBT or an ally? Those were the two choices. So they were worried about exactly how to answer that particular question. Now, if they were, quick off the mark or whatever, they can say, well, I don't believe that LGBT people ought to experience unjust discrimination, and therefore I'm an ally, and you can do this in good faith. But the people that I was talking to were quite worried about not being able to answer that in any kind of positive way, and what would happen to them. So right then and there, they were isolated in their Christian Catholic beliefs, not being able to say what they wanted to say, not being able even to express the things that they believe in. So this is the weaponization of loneliness. It is the turning people away from their fundamental beliefs over a fear that they will be shunned and isolated.
I think it also speaks to your article in general, the need for parents to pay attention to the peer groups of their kids, because peer groups have a massive amount of influence on their kids and their decisions, especially when they aren't mature enough to really stand on their own, and they need their parents to be their guides. Kids that run in bad circles tend to make bad decisions.
Well, without a doubt, that's true. I mean, you know, we live here in Northern Virginia, and we live in something of a Catholic bubble. You know, it's not an impenetrable bubble, but our girls go to a really good, solid, Orthodox Catholic middle school, high school. But that doesn't mean that even within that milieu, there can be influences coming from the outside, which are not that good. The good thing about the milieu that we're in is that the dominant view is the teachings of the church. But absolutely, if you're not in a situation like that, there's every likelihood that there's going to be pressure, peer group pressure on these particular issues, and therefore the fear of being isolated. But it's not, you know, it's not simply about the young, because this kind of pressure can be placed on anybody at any age at any time. In my life, I'm 66. I've lost childhood friends over these issues who will not speak to me anymore. And I think that almost anybody who speaks up on these issues has had that experience.
One of the things that I found very fascinating in going through your article was just this tie between standing up for what is right, good, and true, and recognizing in the person opposite, you know, that conversation, opposite that debate, so like looking past the ugliness of their behavior, looking past the bizarreness of their behavior or the words they say, and finding something of humanity to be able to recognize it. I think that seems like that could be an opportunity for us to maybe reach those people in a way we haven't done before.
Well, you know, I'm engaged in these debates, you know, in the public square, and have been for years. One of the experiences that I have had over the years was I was on in the comment boxes of a particular gay blog that doesn't exist anymore. They used to regularly come after me and my wife and the people who do this kind of work. And one day I dove into the comment boxes. It was kind of fun. And was having a very vigorous debate with this guy about something. I don't remember what. But anyway, at one point, he broke the fourth wall. And in television and plays, the fourth wall is what separates the audience from the players. And sometimes a player can turn and speak directly to the audience. That's breaking the fourth wall. So in this particular instance, he broke the fourth wall. He no longer viewed me as an enemy, and he began a conversation about music.
Hold that thought right there. We're going to come right back to this. Austin Ruse is our guest. He's got a great article over at the crisismagazine.com, the weaponization of loneliness. Fascinating. We're going to pick up right there, breaking the fourth wall. That and much more coming up with Austin Ruse. It's coming up next. Praise be to Jesus Christ. Welcome back to Catholic Drive Time, keeping you informed and inspired. I'm your host, Joe McLean. So good to be on with you. Tito Edwards from BigPulpit.com is going to be our guest at the top of the next hour. If you can join us, we'd love to have you. We're going to catch up on a story from Father Frank Pavone over the weekend. The diocese in Amarillo said, well, we did tell him ahead of time. So what's the story there? We're going to talk about that with Tito Edwards. Do join us if you are able to. Austin Ruse is our guest. He has an article called The Weaponization of Loneliness at crisismagazine.com. And just before the break, Austin, you were talking about this this interesting time where you were trolling people in the com box. And but it turns out you had a sort of a breakthrough here. Tell us about it.
I prefer to say that I was commenting in the comments.
Sure.
Not trolling in the comments.
Let's go with that one.
So this guy says to me, he asked me what my favorite music is. And I told him I prefer jazz, and he talked about classical music, and went on and on and on and on and on about music. And it occurred to me in this exchange that we had found not common ground, but common interests. And I tried this out a few times on Twitter and things like that. You know, you're going back and forth with somebody, and I'll ask them. I remember vividly this young man who was quite incensed about the LGBT issue, and I finally said, "What are you watching on TV these days?" And he tells me, and then I tell him what I'm watching, and we have conversations about television, and I made some recommendations. Weeks later, he comes back to me and thanks me for the recommendations that I had, and it was like, you know, for this particular topic of common interest, we were human beings and not just, you know, nameless, faceless enemies on social media. So finding common ground is harder because, you know, you'll say, well, we both believe in truth. Well, not necessarily. We both believe in this. Well, not necessarily. We look at it different ways. But, man, have you seen the latest episode of Yellowstone? It was amazing. And all of a sudden, you're talking to each other as friends. So, you know, that's one way to break through these hot debates with even strangers on social media. I found it to be highly effective.
Do you think that social media has made people more crass, more less sensitive to common decency? You know, it seems like we can now treat each other in ways where maybe just a generation ago we would have never, even people you disagree with, you would have never just been so blunt, so cold, so crass to them. So vulgar, yeah. Do you think that social media has contributed to that?
You know, without a doubt, it has contributed to the weaponization of political differences. I mean, I think that there have always been political arguments across the dinner table and things like that, but it is certainly worsened and coarsened. You know, and with regard to, you know, vulgarization, several months ago, this new sort of reimagined documentary about the Beatles came out, Let It Be, and we watched, gosh, every single minute of 8 hours of it. And you know what we discovered? Nobody in those, and these were unguarded moments in the studio when they were making the Let It Be album. Nobody dropped an F-bomb. Nobody dropped an S-bomb. When it dawned on me what was going on, it was not a part of their patois. It was not a part of what they talked about. And I'm thinking, how is this possible? The Beatles in the studio and nobody's dropping any cuss words for 8 hours. And it's not like they bleeped them out or anything. Why would they, especially these days? So a lot has changed, even since the 60s. You know, we have this view of the 60s that it was, you know, this crass, vulgar time. I listened to this XM satellite radio station called 60s Gold, and the 60s was full of really happy music. Something has happened since then that has coarsened everything, and it's not just social media. But to your point, social media has really coarsened our discourse, without a doubt. People say things. You know, one of the things that we're struggling with at Crisis Magazine is what to do with the comment boxes. They were taken away by the editor now, you know, several months ago, and I've been pitching them. We've got to bring them back because it's a really great way to get feedback and talk to the readers. But it's really hard because the comment boxes can be bloody ground. I subscribe to the Times of London, and they have a highly moderated comment boxes. You can't even use the word stupid without getting flagged in the comment boxes at the Times of London. So there's a way to do it. But, yeah, it's like you can't have a simple conversation about politics or religion these days without the F-bombs flying and accusations being made and all that kind of stuff. It's sad.
I think listening to you just talk a minute ago about the Beatles and the comment box. I mean, it seems like our society has gotten so bad. In the last segment, I talked about this gentleman in Minnesota who wore a T-shirt, and they were threatening to kick him out if he didn't take his T-shirt off. In Minnesota, they're trying to prevent Christian school teachers there in public schools. They don't want Christians teaching there. In Ontario, they don't want to print Christian books there. I mean, it just seems like society's just getting so bad these days. And then you know, whenever we talk about more serious topics, one of the negative feedbacks we might get in a comment box is, you guys just share the simple gospel and stop fussing with all these scandalous issues. And I'm like, the simple gospel has been preached for 60 years, and it's not helped society. Society seems to get worse, not better. if we don't do something drastic now, it's over, it seems, to many people. Austin, what say you?
Well, I wrote a book, published a book. It was now it's been a little over a year and a half since it came out. It was called Under Siege, No Finer Time to Be a Faithful Catholic. And it made the argument that we're living through among the darkest of times, but also one of the most remarkable epochs that the church has ever known for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is that there are cultural snipers all around us. And this is a remarkable time to be a faithful Catholic. So I look at all this kind of stuff and I say, golly, as my daughter has a T-shirt, a St. Joan T-shirt, that I was made for this. And yes, indeed, we were made for this. This is a remarkable opportunity. So, yeah, absolutely. I think we all have to engage in the public square, in the public debate, and we all have to proclaim the gospel. There's, it's not both and. It's not either or. It's both and. So, talking about public policy is a very important thing. Talking about Jesus and the teachings of the church, also important. And quite frankly, I think that people in the public square ought to be more forthright in, the church teaches this, that, and the other. Yeah. We, in the sort of most modern of ages, have determined that we cannot cite Scripture because, non-believers will turn away from that and they won't be convinced. In my work at the United Nations, the Muslims do not have a problem quoting the Quran.
Right.
And it's highly effective. Yeah. So we prided ourselves at my organization, CFAM, in the UN debates that we only talked about, human rights and international law and things like that. But I think more and more, we're citing Scripture and citing, encyclicals and the teachings of the church. And I honestly think that is a good thing. So, yeah, just back to a previous point, I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and.
The gentleman who was wearing the Jesus Saves T-shirt at the Mall of America, Minnesota over the weekend and got in trouble and they threatened to kick him out. They said it was a religious a garment there, and he was soliciting. And I would have asked, well, all of these ladies wearing the hijabs, is that a religious garment? Can they be asked to remove those? Not going to happen at the Mall of America, trust me. Let's talk about your work at CFAM for a minute or two. There's a lot of talk about the globalist push on, to unify everybody under one common thought, philosophy, social system, and everything else. And it's one of the big complaints I've had, especially in 2022, watching Republicans hand up the redefinition of marriage on a silver platter to liberals. Who's defending marriage? Is there a defense for marriage besides CFAM, of course? At the world stage, it seems like marriage is being under complete assault and is at the risk of being lost forever.
Well, I'll tell you, at the United Nations in UN documents, and that's what we work on. We work on documents and pretty much documents alone. That is to say, the UN speaks to the world through the money that it spends, which we don't have any control over, but also through the documents that it produces, binding treaties and non-binding resolutions. Sexual orientation and gender identity has never really gotten any traction in UN documents.
Praise God.
Why? Because we've been able to put together a coalition large enough to say no. It's like we're up against the European Union without a doubt, the UN agencies. We're all the powers and principalities of the world with hundreds of billions of dollars to spend. But we're always able to find enough African, Middle Eastern countries, sometimes Central American countries, to stand up and say no. So that, for instance, in international law, there's actually, and this is in a hard law treaty, quite a good definition of gender. Men and women, the two sexes in the context of society, is the definition of gender in the document that created the International Criminal Court. Now, the sexual left doesn't like that. They're coming back after 20 years. They're going to try and change it, but I think we'll stop them. So, and even same thing with the life issue. There's no international right to abortion. So in the General Assembly, we've done pretty well. They don't stop. We're having the same debate this week that we had 20 years ago. But for the most part, at the United Nations, in the documents themselves, we've done quite well. Now, with regard to the UN bureaucracy, where we don't have any control, I mean, they're just Looney Tunes. I mean, they say there's an international right to same-sex marriage and gender identity and all that kind of stuff. But those are not normative. Those always come with, the threat of money. But with regard to when the General Assembly, when the nations of the world sit down and negotiate these issues in the General Assembly, we have done quite well. And same-sex marriage has not gotten any traction in the General Assembly. So people ought to take heart that at least in this part of the international stage, things are going pretty well.
How much longer do you think you have before that crumbles?
I think a good long while. We had a debate in the General Assembly that ended in December, and some of these issues came up. And we one of the things that the bad guys at the General Assembly want to say is that all these things are decided by consensus. That is to say, everybody agrees. And so some of these issues came up. So intersectionality came up in a resolution, and we had 60 countries vote against this resolution, which is rare that there's actually a vote in the General Assembly. Generally, they are agreed upon by consensus. 60 countries stood up and said vocally no.
Wow. Austin Ruse, we are very grateful for your time today. Thank you for being on with us, catching us up. Check out his article over at crisismagazine.com, The Weaponization of Loneliness. Austin Ruse, God bless you. God love you, and have a great day, sir.
Thanks, guys.
All right, coming up at the top of the next hour, for anybody that's able to join us, Tito Edwards from BigPulpit.com is going to be our guest. Did Father Frank Pavone know ahead of time? We'll talk about it. That and much more is coming. grnonline.com/CDT.